Florida Congresswoman Paulina Luna has been at the forefront of this issue. Following the July 26th hearing, she said, quote, "This is just the start." Congresswoman Luna joins me now via Zoom. Congresswoman, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, absolutely. So the first question I want to ask you is something that I've also asked other lawmakers who helped lead this hearing. It's about, of course, that hearing back in July. It was very interesting. There were a lot of allegations made, claims made, but important conversation about transparency. And of course, there was a lot of planning that went into this hearing, as you spoke about. I'm curious, what were you most surprised by what you heard?
You know, this is the first time that in congressional history that not only have you had confirmation from people that have been very credible working not only within the government, for the government, admitting to the fact that we are not alone, but more importantly, it was a bipartisan push for transparency. And it was actually very surprising in a good way to hear that both Democrats and Republicans were calling for not only there to be stronger whistleblower protections, as you heard from Grush as he was testifying, not only is he in fear for his safety, but also too that he was facing retribution for coming forward with this information. And then also too, we are still actively being stonewalled in regards to his security clearance so that he can actually brief us. So, I mean, these are all things that going into it, we know, but it's important that it's admitted into the congressional record because, as you know, they're testifying under oath, and it's important evidence for the American people.
I want to get to another point at the top of the conversation. I was particularly excited to talk to you about this topic because you come to it with a unique perspective. You served in the Air Force. You've spoken about conversations that you've had with people who are pilots who have been afraid to come forward with allegations and claims. I presume you have knowledge of what goes on in the airspace up above, and you yourself have worked on an airfield. So I'm curious, how do you bring that background? How has that background guided your perspective on this issue, and particularly your advocacy for transparency for UAPs?
Yeah, of course. Thanks for bringing that up. A lot of people are, they don't necessarily know that I am a vet. So my job was airfield management. So I actually had a unique job in that not only did I work with pilots every single day, but I also worked to ensure that airfields measured up to the FAA safety standards. And then also too, I would do the flight plans for pilots. So basically there's invisible roads in the sky that aircraft need to section off when they fly so that there's no safety issues. And it's incredibly important. I think a lot of people talk about the national security aspect, which is just one aspect of this, but then there's also too the civilian safety aspect. And when you have pilots, especially, you know, you heard Graves talking about that there's multiple commercial airline pilots that are unable to address these issues, to report them. They're facing retaliation from some of these corporate airlines. If they do speak out, they get letters, basically cease and desist letters. They're being threatened to lose their jobs. But also too that you have corporations putting the safety of civilians and people that are paying to use these services over basically transparency. I mean, that's not wrong, and corporatism should not do that. And so when I'm talking and I'm addressing these issues, I always like to inject that because I think a lot of people so quickly can be in the mindset of, oh, this is a conspiracy theorist or it's not true. But I think that stigma and removing that stigma is incredibly important for this discussion. So when I'm asking the questions, I keep that in mind. I also too do like to tailor the questioning to remind people of that. But it is an incredibly important part. And, you know, going back to kind of why this specific topic piqued my interest, after my time serving active duty, I was in the Guard for about a year. And I worked with F-15s. And I remember they responded to, there was an aerospace incursion. They responded immediately. They came back. They were pretty quiet about it. And then one of the pilots, I was kind of like, you know, what was that? He alluded to the fact that it was a UAP. And so after that ended up happening, you know, you have pilots that are even afraid of coming forward to talk about it because they don't want the stigma of being called crazy. But as you're hearing, you know, multiple lawmakers, they're very smart people, scientists, doctors, lawyers, who all report this. And so they can't just blanket label it crazy anymore.
You mentioned transparency, and that's where I wanted to bring the conversation next. It seems like the main issue here is transparency because, you know, just to talk about some things that were said at that hearing, Grush said that the government has non-human material recovered from crash sites. As you mentioned, Graves spoke about the stigma surrounding reporting these these UFO and UAP sightings. So it seems like the issue here is transparency. If people were more transparent, we'd be aware of some of these allegations, if true, and there would potentially be less of a stigma around reporting UFO and UAP sightings. Curious, in your opinion, how is the best way to decrease the stigma and overall increase that transparency when you talk about UAPs and UFOs?
Right now, I think that we're facing a massive issue of overclassification. Even if you, for example, let's say you were flying and you recorded something on your iPhone, right? That would be considered classified information. If it had a UAP, they would obviously hide that information, even though you recorded it, it's on your device. You know, I don't believe that it is fair to the American people to not be able to see information that absolutely has the ability to impact them directly, especially from a national security perspective. And I also don't think it's fair to gaslight the American people. When you have the federal government, when you have these private entities, private agencies, individuals deciding what the American people and their representatives should see, then you no longer have a representative body of government, which is exactly what we are, which is exactly why I think that you're seeing the push from both sides for this transparency. But I would hope, and what I'm trying to accomplish and where we're going forward with this is that, you know, had Representative Gates not had the whistleblowers come forward to his office, had we not gone to Eglin with Burchett and Gates and experienced what we experienced from the Pentagon, the Department of the Air Force, and then even being stonewalled from questioning all of the pilots that came forward, I don't think that this hearing would have happened.
You spoke about this effort to try to get information and hear more information in a SCIF, and that's what I wanted to get to next. In an interview after last month's hearing, you said, quote, "The first step in the right direction is going to be getting that information in a SCIF and seeing what we can release to the American people." What is the status of that effort in terms of you guys being able to go into a SCIF? For those who don't know, a SCIF is a sensitive facility where you're able to view sensitive documents and information. What's the status of that effort? And if you can just talk a little bit about why that would be helpful for increasing transparency and letting the American people be more aware of information that's out there.
Yeah, of course. So as you heard from Grutsch's testimony, there were some things that he could not address in the hearing because of the classification of that information. Now, the excuse that the Department of Defense is using for us not being able to get a SCIF is that Grusch doesn't have an active clearance. So unless he has an active clearance, they're saying that he can't divulge that information to us, which is, one, I believe, false. And then also, two, it just is another point that we're trying to make, that the Department of Defense is literally trying to stonewall us. But the status is as follows. We are working on him, getting him a clearance, for one. And then also, two, we're working on getting access to be allowed to use a SCIF. And the good thing is that we have multiple lawmakers that have signed onto a letter that Representative Burchett has put forward. And then we are also requesting, and we have put out a letter to myself, Jared Moskowitz, Representative Gates, and Representative Burchett, have all signed on to a letter to Speaker McCarthy to ask for a special select committee to investigate this so that we have subpoena power. Because as you're seeing, there's so much stuff that we've had to really overcome hurdle-wise that they've just tried to throw at us to prevent us from doing this.
First, I just want to follow up on the SCIF part. You mentioned in an interview following the July hearing that you were going to put pressure on the Intelligence Committee to provide lawmakers with a SCIF with this information. Can you elaborate on what kind of pressure you're talking about here?
Whether it's public pressure, whether it's naming names, whether it is literally doing, as you saw, with putting out letters and requests. You know, the fact is that Grusch has received pushback from the intelligence community. Even Representative Burchett had stated in the hearing that when he filed an amendment to a bill for the FAA so that we could simply get reporting back to Congress so that we could investigate the topics of UAP, that it was the intelligence community that actually killed the amendment in the FAA bill. You know, the intelligence community is not above law, and they're not above the American people. It is a select group of people that have become these megalomaniacs with information and think that they can control everything. I
spoke to Congressman Burchett as part of this event, and he told me that he doesn't think that Congress will be able to stage more hearings on this issue until a select committee is created. He just doesn't. That's just how he thinks the sequence of events will be. I'm curious to know if you agree with him that the select committee will have to be established for there to be more hearings on the topic.
I think for doing the hearings in Washington, he's correct, because that subpoena power is so powerful, especially with some of these agencies that you're seeing that are trying to stonewall us or play games with this entire situation. But it doesn't necessarily mean that we can't do the field hearings. And I think the field hearings, again, are very important because we can bring the press, we can bring the people directly to these areas where we know that they're either hiding information or they're not being fully transparent. And then we can put the public pressure campaigns on that. But yes, Representative Burchett is correct. The select committee would be incredibly powerful. And I think that, it was Speaker McCarthy that actually basically allowed us to do this hearing. So I think that he is supportive, although I haven't heard back directly from his office because we signed on to the letter, but the letter did not come from our office initially. So it would be an update, I believe, from Representative Gates' office.
You floated the possibility of defunding individuals if transparency is not increased. I just want to read the exact quote. You said, quote, "If we continue to see this wall of silence where they're giving us the runaround, we reserve the right to actually defund positions." I just wanted to ask, who exactly are you talking about when you're talking about defunding, and how exactly would you go about that? Is something like the Holman Rule, or do you have something else in mind?
No, 100% is the Holman Rule. That's kind of one of our toolkits that we have as Congress. Obviously, no, Congress has the power of the purse, so we can defund any federally appointed position if we see that they are stonewalling us and not acting in the vested interest of the American people. And again, that's not just Republicans saying this, is Democrats too that would support that. So as of right now, based on the responses that we received back, and really I think that there's a lot riding on whether or not we get the select committee. But even then, so when we are pursuing this, let's say we go to Eglin Air Force Base, they don't want to bring the information forward that they showed us. We know it's not classified and that we can bring it forward. That's in that instance where we would actually bring forward that legislation for the appropriations to defund those positions.
All right, Congresswoman Paulina Luna, Republican from Florida, thank you so much for joining us today. A really important and interesting conversation.
Thank you.